Ethan's white moonlight divorced after being cheated on. Without hesitation he broke up with me and posted it on his social media. I wished I could go back 8 years and change the fate of Emma, who had married that scumbag. She was the one he had always longed for. Later both of us were transported back 8 years in time. He altered Emma's fate to prevent her from marrying the scumbag, while I changed my fate of being with him. When I saw Ethan's social media post, I had just finished an 8-hour surgery. On my way back to the office, I collapsed in the hallway from exhaustion. When I woke up, I was in a dim, unfamiliar private room surrounded by colorful flashing lights and blaring music. Someone patted my shoulder and teased, "Claire, your drinking tolerance is terrible. Just one drink and you're out." My blurred vision slowly focused and I realized it was Emma in front of me. She wore a short wine-red dress and had her slightly curled long hair cascading down. I stared at her radiant and captivating face, remaining silent for a few seconds before stumbling into the bathroom. Looking at the mirror, I saw a fair and delicate face staring back at me. I splashed cold water on my forehead repeatedly, unable to deny the reality. The scars were gone. I had traveled back to 8 years ago, the year I had just started college. Today was my roommate Emma's birthday. I had accidentally drunk a high-proof drink and passed out on the couch for a long time. Groggy emerging from the bathroom, I bumped into someone before I could apologize. A familiar deep voice said near my ear, "Sorry, are you okay?" My fingers instinctively tightened around my phone. I looked up to see the man before me. He was tall and well-built with sharp deep features. He wore a loose plain black t-shirt. It was Ethan. Our gazes met and lingered for a few seconds. I ignored the ambiguous look in his eyes, lowered mine and calmly replied, "I'm fine," before brushing past him and returning to the couch. I had just taken a sip of bottled water when Ethan entered the room. Emma greeted him with a bright smile, clinging to his arm as she introduced him to us. "This is my brother." The vibrant lights continued to swirl as he stood with one hand in his pocket, glancing down at us with a faint nod. If not for the brief encounter in the hallway earlier, this would have been our first meeting in this lifetime. Ethan was Emma's biological brother. He was also the man I had loved and been with for 6 years. It wasn't until Emma's wedding day that I realized the one he loved wasn't me. He had gotten recklessly drunk that night, and while holding me in his arms he murmured tenderly, "Emma, Emma." That moment I felt completely hollow, frozen in place. It took me a while to process what was happening. The person he loved was Emma, but that was when I loved him the most, so I pretended nothing had happened, stayed with him and kept believing his claim that she's just my sister. Years later, when Emma divorced after being cheated on, I overheard her crying in Ethan's arms, saying, "Ethan, I never loved him. I've always loved you. Do you still want me?" He explained that their mother had a heart condition and had threatened to end her life if they were together, forcing him to feign affection for someone else and pair me with him. I didn't know if that was true, but Ethan believed her. That same night he approached me and after a long silence said, "Hey Claire, let's break up." I looked at his handsome face and didn't even manage to ask the obvious why before being called away for an emergency surgery. Suppressing my emotions with logic and composure, I spent 8 hours in the operating room. When I came out, the first thing I saw was Ethan's social media post. "I wish I could go back 8 years to change Emma's fate of marrying that scumbag." Now that I've returned to that time, I finally noticed the details I had previously ignored or perhaps deliberately overlooked, like the birthday cake Ethan had personally made for Emma, the way he gently coaxed the wine bottle out of her hands, or how he unhesitatingly carried her on his back when the party ended and she drunkenly insisted on being carried. The other 2 roommates marveled at how good her brother was to her, and back then I naively believed he was just her brother. That's why later, when Emma found someone she liked and started pairing Ethan with me, Ethan's kindness and attentiveness had indeed moved me. But when the truth was revealed, I realized that his gentleness had never been directed at me. Whether it was a birthday or an anniversary, he always seemed disinterested. Yet whenever Emma was around, his attention was entirely on her from beginning to end. Ethan only loved Emma. Like now, as I was sitting in the back seat of Ethan's car sharing the space with my roommate who was passed out drunk, Ethan glanced sideways at Emma asleep in the front passenger seat. A strand of her long hair fluttered in the evening breeze. In the dim light, I silently observed as Ethan reached out his right hand toward Emma and softly murmured, "Emma, this time I won't let you marry him." My heart pounded violently. At that moment I closed my eyes, plunging into darkness, but the realization was clear. Ethan had also traveled back in time. He wouldn't let Emma marry anyone else, and I Wouldn't stay with him again. Back at the dormitory, lying on a bed that felt both familiar and foreign, I stared at the ceiling fans spinning lazily, blowing waves of warm air. My head throbbed slightly as I drifted into a fitful sleep. In my dreams I seemed trapped in an endless loop, reliving the 8 years from meeting Ethan to breaking up with him over and over again. I heard him say, "Claire, let's break up." What finally pulled me from the nightmare was the vibration of my phone. I opened my eyes, dazed for a few seconds, then grabbed my phone and glanced at my schedule. Suddenly, I remembered I had a part-time job tutoring a high school student in English. Glancing at the time, I quickly got out of bed, freshened up, grabbed a random bag of bread and headed out. Thankfully my subject was English, and because my work required me to read cutting-edge medical research, I hadn't let my English skills slip. I skimmed through the teaching materials beforehand to refresh my memory. The student was a high school girl. After finishing the prepared lesson, I began checking her English composition assigned by her school teacher. The topic was a simple one: me in 10 years. Resting her chin on her hand, she asked me, "Miss Claire, do you think I could become a comic artist in 10 years?" I replied confidently, "Yes, you can. You won't even need 10 years. In 8 years you'll have a massive fan base and be a very popular artist." She tilted her head and asked then, "Will Miss Claire become a doctor too?" "Yes," I said just then. Her eyes lit up and she pointed excitedly toward the window. "Look, Miss Claire, that must be Mr. Ryan. He'll definitely become a physics researcher." Through the rain-splattered glass, I looked up and met the gaze of a tall figure walking under a black umbrella. My heart clenched tightly and a flood of memories surfaced. He wouldn't live to see 10 years later. 2 years from now he would die in a car accident. His name was Ryan Monroe, a prized student of the infamous demon professor in our neighboring university's physics department. He was often the center of conversations among girls, frequently appearing on confession walls across universities. Known for his unparalleled looks and talent, the only perceived flaw was his humble beginnings. My interactions with him were minimal. I had seen him a few times in our school library. The most vivid memory, however, was during my junior year when I went to the hospital to visit Ethan, who was sick. To her, after listening to the entire story, she sighed with disappointment, but then added, "Well, this has potential. I'll ship it for now." I chuckled helplessly and glanced at Ryan's contact in my phone. His username was simply Ryan, and his profile picture was a plain white origami crane. After some thought, I renamed him as Mr. Ryan in my contact. His social media was clean and sparse, with only one post: "The wind is picking up." The timestamp matched the day we first met. For some reason, I was reminded of another timeline. On the anniversary of Ryan's death, I visited his grave with a bouquet of flowers. The rain had just stopped, and the setting sun painted the sky in hues of gold and orange. My shadow fell on his tombstone as I silently gazed at his photo, the same composed and gentle face. Suddenly, a breeze swept by, lifting the strands of hair that had fallen over my face. The leaves rustled in the wind, sounding like the opening chapter of a new story. Then time reversed, and I was brought back to this moment where we met again. I felt fortunate to have returned before meeting Ethan. Instead of wasting this second chance on revenge, I decided to let us become strangers. Strangers, just like that day on the basketball court when he said he didn't know me. Freshman year was chaotic and hurried, and it ended abruptly. If my memory served me right, among the incoming freshmen at Ryan's university, there would soon be someone Emma would fall for. He was Ethan's direct junior in the previous timeline. They met at a party organized by Ethan, and Emma quickly developed feelings for him. From there, she started pairing me with Ethan through her deliberate matchmaking and manufactured coincidences. Ethan eventually asked me to be with him. Now that Ethan had also returned to the past, he would likely prevent Emma from meeting that boy, ensuring he could be with her. That seemed like the inevitable conclusion. But fate often has a way of surprising us. During the last professional exam before the break, I was seated diagonally behind Ryan. I had just finished my paper and was about to hand it in when I noticed him suddenly wake from a nap. He stood up abruptly, grabbed his exam paper, glanced at it, and then looked around the room. Grabbing the arm of the confused student next to him, he asked, "What year is it now? Tell me, what year is this?" I silently watched his back as I walked up to submit my paper and left the room. Outside the exam hall, Ethan was waiting. As I passed him, he called out to me. I stopped and looked at him questioningly. He asked, "Are you with him now?" I didn't know what he meant by that question, so I simply replied, "What does it have to do with you?" After that, because of the break, I didn't see Ethan or Ryan for quite some time. I thought that starting over, Ethan and Emma would finally find their way to happiness together. But I was wrong. Even in this new timeline, Emma didn't choose Ethan. She still fell for Ethan's junior, just as she had in the previous timeline. Her words to Ethan after her divorce, "You were the one I loved all along," were nothing more than a lie. What surprised me was that this time, Emma didn't try to pair me with Ethan. Instead, she focused on pairing Ethan with the woman who, in the future, would be the reason her husband cheated on her. I had no idea what happened during the break, but when we met again, Emma and that woman had already become friends. The night air was chilly as I hugged my books and walked back to the dorm. From a distance, I saw Ethan and Emma talking downstairs. Without pausing, I passed by them. Their conversation drifted into my ears as I walked away. "Emma, I'll say it again, he's no good. You're too naive. If you don't stay away from him, you'll end up being hurt." Emma's coy voice responded, "Ethan, trust me. You don't understand him. He's really a great guy. Just try being with him for a while, okay? Please." Months later, Emma officially announced her new relationship. That day, I attended a party only to encounter a drunken Ethan in the hallway outside the private room. On my way back from the restroom, he suddenly pulled me into his arms. The overpowering smell of alcohol engulfed me. I struggled, but the more I resisted, the tighter his grip became. His low, hoarse voice murmured in my ear. "Emma, why are you with him? He'll hurt you in the future. You must have been forced into this. I know you like me. I know the one you love is me." When my struggles failed, I raised my leg, ready to kick his shin. But just as I was about to, the hand pressing against my back abruptly let go. The next moment, Ethan was forcefully yanked away, his wrist seized, and he was thrown to the ground. I nearly fell due to the sudden release, but a strong arm caught me around my waist, steadying me. It was Ryan. He happened to be here for his group celebratory dinner and had come outside for some air, accidentally stumbling upon this scene. Ethan, clearly sobering up after the impact, leaned against the wall, his expression a mix of embarrassment and anger. He sneered at me. "Claire, every word you say is a waste of time." Ignoring him, I grabbed Ryan's arm and was about to leave when Ethan's voice rang out again, laced with sarcasm. "Aren't you proud of yourself, Claire? I know you've always liked me. Seeing that I didn't end up with Emma must make you happy, right? But even if you're with him now, so what? He's just a dead man walking. He's going to die anyway." Ethan's words made it clear that he was confusing events and emotions from both timelines, his instability driving him to lash out recklessly. I didn't care what he said about me, but he had no right to talk about Ryan like that. I stopped in my tracks and turned back to face Ethan, who was still looking at us with disdain. Word by word, I told him. "Shut up, Ethan. He's not going to die. Because I'm here now. I'm going to change his fate." Even though I couldn't go back to the moment when his father sacrificed himself to save others or the time before his mother's illness took her life, I had returned to this moment. I could save him now. As we stepped out of the hotel, the sound of car horns echoed in the distance. Only then did I realize I was still holding Ryan's hand. His palm felt warm and slightly damp. I paused for a moment before quickly letting go and hiding my hand behind my back, clenching it into a fist to conceal my embarrassment. "Sorry, and, thank you," I said, trying to compose myself. Ryan's hand, which had been resting at his side, clenched into a loose fist. Looking down slightly, he asked what he said earlier. My heart skipped a beat, and I interrupted him hastily. He was drunk and spouting nonsense. Don't believe a word of it, Ryan. You have a bright future ahead of you. You still have so much time left. We stood in silence for a few moments before Ryan suddenly smiled, his demeanor relaxing. And you? You'll definitely become an excellent doctor in the future, right? I smiled back at him, bright and determined. As long as I'm alive, I'll do everything I can to save lives. Me and caused a scene. I silently watched her tantrum, then calmly called security. To escort her out, left out the door to the psychiatry department. I told her. You should get checked out too. My coworkers sighed again. They really are from the same family. Both seem to have a few screws loose. After some peace, I encountered Ethan and Emma again a month later. I was at the lab to pick up some documents from a colleague when I saw Ethan furiously throwing papers at 3 people across the room. I didn't pay it much attention and turned to leave later. I learned from my coworker what had happened. Ethan had overheard a heated argument between Emma and her mother, during which her mother revealed that they had a blood relationship. A DNA test confirmed it. Ethan and Emma were half siblings sharing the same father. Their birth dates were only 3 months apart, meaning Ethan's father had cheated while his mother was pregnant. The Lima once told Ethan about their mother threatening to end her life if they were together had come full circle and turned out to be true. By my day, I was invited to give a lecture on first aid at a university. The auditorium was packed and the lecture ended successfully. As I packed up my materials, I noticed a familiar silhouette in the dispersing crowd, but before I could get a clear look, the figure disappeared. The sky had darkened and a light rain began to fall. As I reached the auditorium doors, after a moment's hesitation, I used my folder to shield my head and prepared to dash into the rain. Suddenly a black umbrella appeared over me. A familiar, faintly bitter yet comforting scent reached me as water droplets slid off the slanted edge of the umbrella. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, my hand still holding the folder above my head, and slowly turned around. There he was, Ryan, whom I hadn't seen in 6 years. He looked just as he had back then, his face calm and cold, his sharp features illuminated by the soft glow of the street lights. After the explosion, Ryan had been taken abroad by his professor for medical treatment. He had been in a coma for nearly 2 years. After waking up, he stayed overseas for continued recovery and pursued his studies, eventually joining a research institute. Now he had returned to teach as a professor in the physics department at this university. He summarized those 6 years in just a few simple sentences. I blinked, countless words I wanted to say condensing into just 2. That's great. He was alive. It was great to know that Ryan, once Mr. Ryan to me, now Professor Ryan, was still here. What hadn't changed was his popularity among women. It was said that his lectures were always so packed that some students had to stand to listen. Out of curiosity, I thought about sneaking into one of his lectures during my free time. Unfortunately, on the day I chose, his class had been switched with another professor's. I didn't know until it was too late. Sitting in an interior corner by the window, I realized trying to leave would only draw attention to myself, as standing up would disrupt a large section of the students around me. I hesitated for half the lecture before texting Ryan, I wanted to attend your class, but it seems I entered the wrong one. What should I do now? Just as I sent the message, the professor unexpectedly called on me to answer a question. I stared at the geology problem on the board, clueless. Taking a deep breath, I was about to apologize and admit I'd walked into the wrong class when a soft beat behind me gave me the answer. Without thinking, I repeated it and got it right. As I sat back down, my phone vibrated. Ryan hadn't responded yet. Thinking about the help from the student behind me, I turned to thank them, only to meet a familiar face. Ryan was sitting casually dressed in a black hoodie with the hood slightly pulled over his head. His bangs hung low, covering part of his eyebrows. For a brief moment, I felt as though I was seeing the Ryan from 8 years ago. Quickly, I turned back around, pretending I hadn't noticed. A moment later, my phone buzzed with a new message. I noticed you walked into this classroom. I was curious what kind of class could interest a doctor so much that she'd attended herself. Above his text was the one I had sent him earlier. Before I could respond, another message came in. So it turns out this is actually my lecture. I couldn't help but smile. Over the 6 years we've been apart, Ryan's personality seemed to have changed slightly. He still carried that cool and distant demeanor, but now he seemed a bit less restrained from then on. My relationship with Ryan returned to what it had been 6 years ago, though with an inexplicable new dynamic. First, I couldn't put my finger on what was different. That was until one day when I went to visit him at the university and overheard a conversation. One of his colleagues, seemingly frustrated by love, sigh and asked him, "Professor Ryan, how do I make her realize I like her?" Then after a pause they added, "But you wouldn't understand the pain of unrequited love. You don't have that kind of trouble, do you?" Ryan didn't respond. The colleague pressed further, "Tell me, have you rejected so many people because you already like someone?" Holding my breath, I heard him reply softly with a single word, "Yes." I didn't interrupt. Silently I turned and left. 6 years is long enough for many things to change, I had to admit. I liked Ryan. I couldn't pinpoint when the feeling shifted from wanting to make up for what he'd lost to romantic affection, but at that time, knowing there would be no outcome, I chose to suppress it for a long time. Afterward I used work and overtime as excuses to keep my interactions with him limited, maintaining a polite but distant relationship that lasted until Ryan began showing up in my consultation room 3 days in a row. Finally, I couldn't hold back a small sigh of exasperation. "Ryan, you don't need to come every day," he was persistent, responding seriously. I registered and queued up. "I mean, you don't need to keep coming for something so minor." He was silent for a moment, then lowered his voice as though holding something back. "Actually, I'm not coming for the medical issues." Before he could finish, a large aggressive man suddenly stormed into the room. I immediately recognized him as the man who had recently caused his wife's death by domestic violence. After enduring years of abuse, she had overdosed on medication, and despite the hospital's best efforts had died during treatment. He had always believed that doctors were responsible for his wife's death, and now in his rage he pointed a knife at me, shouting venomously, "It's your fault my wife died."